On the evening of 22nd October 1883, in the new Metropolitan Opera House at Broadway and 39th Street in New York, the gaslight caught on 100 pairs of white kid gloves in the golden horseshoe of boxes. Reporters had already published diagrams of who would sit where, treating the first tier as a map of power rather than a seating chart. One piece in the New York Tribune even printed the names of box holders as if they were a cast list. In box 18, a young heiress smooths the buttons of her elbow-length gloves before leaning forward, aware that the real performance, for her, is not on the stage where Christine Nilsson is about to sing Faust, but across the house where familiar faces are turned toward her. She adjusts her posture the way her governess taught her, ensuring the fall of silk and diamonds is legible from the far balcony. On the other side of town, the old Academy of Music stands open but underfilled. Some of its famous 18 boxes are dark. The newspapers will note the brilliance of the Met's audience and say little about those empty balconies. The gloves in the new house gleam. The silence in the old one costs more than anyone will admit. By the winter season of 1878-79 at the Academy of Music on 14th Street and Irving Place in Manhattan, the pattern of New York's elite social life had solidified into a weekly ritual as predictable as Sunday services. Monday opera nights marked the pulse of society. The Academy, opened in 1854, had become the undisputed center of fashionable gathering, and within its ornate interior, the 18 private boxes arranged in a horseshoe around the auditorium functioned as the most visible markers of social position in the city. Social arbiters like Mrs. Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor and her advisor Ward McAllister presided from these boxes, seats that were inherited and guarded with fierce exclusivity by what contemporaries called the upper tens, the old Knickerbocker families whose fortunes predated the Civil War and whose genealogies stretched back to Dutch colonial settlement. The boxes were listed by family name in society columns, and observers understood that the real news on any Monday evening was not which opera was being performed, but which of the right women were present, which were conspicuously absent, and who might be visiting in someone else's box. Later, decades after the Academy's social dominance had ended, novelist Edith Wharton would recall in her memoir A Backward Glance how the building's intimate scale, its tight horseshoe of boxes curving around the orchestra and rising only 2 tiers, allowed the old elite to see and scrutinize every face in the house. This visibility was both the point and the problem. Everyone could be observed, which meant everyone could be judged, ranked, and if necessary, excluded. Surviving newspapers from the period and theater engravings preserved in archives show the silhouettes of elegantly dressed women along the gilt balustrades, fans, fluttering in gloved hands, the gleam of family jewels under gaslight creating a constellation of wealth and power, visible from every angle in the house. The sensory experience of the Academy on opera nights was distinctive. The rustle of silk as women moved within their boxes, the smell of gas lighting mixing with perfume and the faint mustiness of velvet upholstery, the warmth of closely packed bodies in an era before effective ventilation systems, all contributed to an atmosphere of luxurious confinement. The boxes themselves were relatively small, fitted with perhaps 6 to 8 chairs, decorated with draperies and small mirrors that reflected candlelight and allowed their occupants to check their appearance. At the end of each performance, women would pause before rising, drawing on their long evening gloves if they had removed them during the opera, carefully buttoning each tiny button from wrist to elbow, a process that could take several minutes and served to seal their bodies back into the armor of etiquette before they stepped from the semi-private space of the box into the broader public gaze of the lobby and street. The opera box, as one cultural historian examining this period has noted, functioned as a physical representation of elevated social status, a literal platform raising certain families above the rest of the audience. The gloved hand that crossed the box's gilt rail was a boundary line between those who belonged to New York's innermost circle and those who merely observed from below. The exclusivity was absolute and deliberate. Those who lacked a box at the Academy were, in the social calculus of the late 1870s, functionally invisible regardless of their wealth or accomplishments. Conversely, Those who occupied boxes on Monday nights were never unseen, never permitted the luxury of privacy or casual attendance. Every appearance was noted, every absence remarked upon, every detail of dress and deportment subject to immediate evaluation and later discussion. On a cold evening in January 1880, outside the Academy of Music's brick and brownstone facade on Irving Place, the carriages of Vanderbilts, Goulds, and Morgans pulled up to deposit their wealthy passengers. But these industrial fortunes, however vast, could only enter other families' boxes as guests. For these representatives of new money, made in railroads, and mining and finance during and after the Civil War, the Academy's severely limited number of boxes had become an instrument of social exclusion more effective than any club blackball or cut directly. Contemporary accounts of what historians would later term the Opera War document how the Knickerbocker elite who controlled the Academy had effectively monopolized the boxes, passing them from parents to children in a closed system that prevented newcomers from purchasing even a single box regardless of how much money they offered. The boxes were not for sale to outsiders. They were hereditary positions, property but also something more, symbols of social legitimacy that could not be acquired through mere wealth. Alva Vanderbilt, wife of William Kissam Vanderbilt, and already chafing against the social barriers that old New York maintained against railroad fortunes, particularly resented this exclusion. When she appeared at the Academy as a guest in another family's box, society columns might record the details of her elaborate Worth gowns and the famous Vanderbilt diamonds, but the coverage could not disguise the fundamental reality. She was visible in these spaces, but not sovereign, allowed to attend but not to control, admitted on sufferance rather than by right. In private correspondence, among those attempting to reform or break into the closed circles of New York society, letters preserved in various family archives and institutional collections, the Academy's boxes are described less as comfortable theater seats than as fortifications, hereditary strongpoints that allowed their holders to defend their social position against the siege of new fortunes. The metaphor was apt. The old families understood that controlling access to the most visible and prestigious social spaces gave them power to regulate entry into society itself, to decide which families would be acknowledged and which would remain, however wealthy, perpetually outside. Upstairs in her Academy box on a typical Monday evening, Mrs. Caroline Astor was said by contemporary observers to resemble a walking chandelier, her jewelry so extensive and magnificent that it became part of the architectural effect of the house itself, a glittering fixture as permanent and imposing as the gilt and plaster of the interior. In the lobby during intermissions, young heiresses from families seeking acceptance would adjust their own gloves nervously before approaching Mrs. Astor's box rail to pay their respects, practice gestures of deference. These approaches, learned as carefully as language, or dance steps and freighted with nearly as much significance as a formal presentation at court. The physical layout of the Academy reinforced these hierarchies. The boxes were arranged in a strict order, with the most prestigious locations at the center of the horseshoe, where sight lines to the stage were optimal and visibility from the rest of the house was maximum. Lesser boxes occupied the sides, where angles made viewing more difficult and social visibility slightly diminished. The orchestra seats below, while offering in some ways better acoustic and visual access to the actual performance, were socially inferior, occupied by those who could afford opera tickets but lacked the connections or pedigree to secure a box. The opera in this arrangement taught women that even admission to elite spaces could feel like exclusion if the vantage point was borrowed rather than owned, if one's presence depended on someone else's invitation rather than one's own inherent right. The lesson was particularly sharp for the wives and daughters of new fortunes who could see the boxes, who could even occasionally sit in them, but who could not call them their own. The answer to this locked door would not be petitions for admission or gradual social climbing. It would be the construction of an entirely new opera house. On 24 May 1883, in the offices of the Metropolitan Opera House Company at a location in Manhattan, The 70 shareholders of the new opera house under construction at Broadway and 39th Street drew lots to determine the assignment of the building's 70 private boxes. The list of subscribers read like a roster of New York's newest and most aggressive fortunes. William Kissam Vanderbilt, whose grandfather Cornelius had built a railroad empire; J. Pierpont Morgan, already dominating American finance; Robert Goulet and Ogden Goulet, brothers whose family real estate holdings made them among the city's wealthiest landlords; James Roosevelt, representing an older Dutch family that had embraced new commercial opportunities. Each box in the new Metropolitan represented both a tangible real estate asset — the initial subscriptions cost up to $7,500, an enormous sum in 1883, and a future financial obligation, since box holders understood they would be assessed annually to cover the opera company's inevitable operating deficits. The Metropolitan was being built not by a municipality or a civic organization, but by a private corporation of wealthy men who wanted opera boxes and were willing to pay whatever it cost to secure them. The financial structure made the boxes effectively hereditary, since selling a subscription meant finding someone willing to assume both the prestige and the ongoing financial burden. When the Metropolitan Opera House opened on the evening of 22nd October 1883, with a performance of Gounod's Faust starring Swedish soprano Christine Nilsson, the golden horseshoe of boxes, actually 2 tiers of boxes plus baignoires, lower boxes at stage level, was described by multiple observers as ablaze with jewels and fashionable gowns. The dresses, many by Worth of Paris and other celebrated couturiers like Paquin, seemed to answer each other from box to box in a competitive display of wealth and taste, creating a visual spectacle that some found more compelling than anything happening on stage. The Dramatic Mirror, a theatrical trade publication, noted somewhat archly that all the nouveaux riches were on hand for opening night, a comment that captured both the social reality of the new house and the resentment it provoked among defenders of the old Academy establishment. Mrs. Perrin Stevens, a socially ambitious woman who had managed to secure positions in both the old and new social orders, famously divided her opening night between the Academy of Music and the Metropolitan, attending the first act at one house and later acts at the other, testing the balance of social power between the two institutions. The physical experience of the new Metropolitan differed dramatically from the intimate Academy. The building was enormous, designed to seat over 3,000 people, and the scale of the horseshoe of boxes was correspondingly grander. The boxes were larger, more elaborately decorated, and more numerous. The very abundance of boxes, 70 rather than 18, changed the social mathematics. Exclusivity now derived not from scarcity, but from location within the horseshoe, and from the ongoing ability to maintain such an expensive perch in the city's social landscape. Women seated in the new boxes on opening night had to learn different physical choreography than what had worked at the Academy. The distances were greater, the sight lines different, the acoustic properties of the much larger hall requiring adjustment, but certain rituals remained constant: the careful adjustment of long evening gloves, the precise management of silk skirts and elaborate trains, the awareness that one was simultaneously watching and being watched, performing cultivation and refinement for an audience that extended far beyond the immediate neighbors in adjacent boxes. The box had become property in a new and more explicit way than the old Academy boxes had ever been. Shares in a corporation, documented in legal papers, transferable under specific conditions. But ownership brought its own burdens. The box was simultaneously a stage that these women would have to learn how to occupy night after night, season after season, and a financial commitment that would test even substantial fortunes when economic conditions changed. Owning a box, as they would discover, was only the beginning. The real question would be how and when and with what degree of apparent ease to sit in it while managing the weight of expectation that came with such prominent placement. By the late 1880s, opera boxes in major cities had become transatlantic symbols of cultural capital and social position, functioning according to remarkably similar rules from New York to London to Paris. In New York, The winter social season officially began with the opening of the Metropolitan Opera in October and continued through Lent, with weekly attendance at the opera considered de rigueur for anyone claiming membership in the city's inner circle. Missing too many Monday nights at the Met could signal social decline, illness, or family scandal. Absences were noted and interpreted. In London's Royal Opera House at Covent Garden and at the Palais Garnier in Paris, aristocratic families similarly used their opera boxes as semi-private salons, spaces designed as much for conversation and strategic social display as for actually listening to music. Contemporary accounts from all three cities describe how opera-goers in the boxes often paid minimal attention to the performances, instead conducting social business, receiving visitors from other boxes during intermissions, making introductions between young people, negotiating invitations and alliances, with the opera itself functioning as background and pretext. Instruction in how to be properly seen in an opera box, the correct posture for sitting and standing, the management of gloves and fans and opera glasses, the choreography of entering and exiting at appropriate moments, was woven into the broader education of upper-class girls alongside languages, music, and letter writing. The box was one more semi-public room they would need to learn to inhabit according to rules they had no part in creating, performing refinement within a space that was simultaneously prestigious and constraining. In the winter of 1891, in a substantial townhouse just off Fifth Avenue in New York, a French governess drilled her teenage pupil in the precise protocol for attending the opera. Gloves must be on before leaving the carriage and should remain on throughout the evening, except possibly during supper. The back must be kept straight at all times. Eyes should be lowered modestly when first entering the box and only then raised to survey the house. Conversation should be soft enough not to disturb neighbors but animated enough to signal social ease. Victorian etiquette books from this period, including popular American editions of European manuals, insisted with remarkable consistency that a lady must never go out without gloves, and that the public act of buttoning gloves was improper. A lady's gloves should already be fastened before she became visible in public spaces. The gloves worn to the opera were typically white kid leather, elbow length for unmarried women and extending higher for married women, with numerous tiny buttons running from wrist up the forearm. Fastening these buttons required either assistance from a maid or considerable dexterity and patience. Correspondence between mothers and the principals of finishing schools, preserved in archives at institutions like Miss Porter's School in Farmington, Connecticut, and in records from European schools like Swiss pensionnats near Lausanne and Geneva, shows parents explicitly requesting that their daughters receive training in deportment for the theater and opera, alongside more academic subjects like French conversation and music theory. Opera nights were treated as examinations of a sort. Would a young woman sit with appropriate grace, respond to introductions with neither excessive eagerness nor off-putting reserve, appear interested in the performance without the unseemly intensity of genuine musical passion, maintain composure during long acts? The young heiress being trained in these protocols practiced small gestures repeatedly. The smooth adjustment of her glove fingers, pulling gently at each fingertip to ensure proper fit, became a useful stalling movement that could buy a few seconds to compose her expression before responding to an unexpected question or greeting. The placement of her opera glasses, whether to hold them while seated or to lay them aside, when to raise them to view the stage, and when such attention might seem pedantic, required judgment that had to appear instinctive, but was in fact carefully learned. The physical training extended beyond simple etiquette into the realm of endurance, sitting absolutely upright for 3 or 4 hours, corseted and in heavy silk gowns, in boxes that could become stuffy and overheated as the evening progressed, demanded stamina that had to be developed gradually. Young women were taught to breathe shallowly, to move minimally, to maintain the appearance of relaxed attention even when fatigued or uncomfortable. Long before she would own or regularly occupy an opera box of her own, the heiress in training understood that such spaces required a particular kind of disciplined performance. The box was not a comfortable chair from which to enjoy music. It was a platform for displaying cultivated femininity, and every element of her presence there, her posture, her clothing, her expressions, her movements, would be observed and evaluated by people whose judgments could determine her social future. On a damp February evening in 1894, in the backstage corridors of the Metropolitan Opera House, the air smelled of dust, sizing from scenery flats, and the faint petroleum odor of gaslighting not yet fully converted to electric. Upstairs in the boxes, the atmosphere was entirely different and considerably more oppressive, thick with the competing scents of French perfumes, the smoke from cigars that men smoked in the corridors during intermissions, and the heavier animal smell of closely packed bodies in an era when daily bathing was not universal and deodorants did not exist. The physical experience of wearing appropriate evening dress in an opera box involved constraints that extended far beyond etiquette into the realm of genuine discomfort. Surviving fashion plates from the 1890s and actual gowns preserved in museum collections, like those held by the Metropolitan Museum of Art and the Museum of the City of New York, show how evening bodices for opera and balls were cut to display shoulders, décolletage, and whatever family jewels a woman possessed, while simultaneously controlling the torso with whalebone corsets that could reduce waists to 18 inches or less. Measurements that contemporary doctors warned could compress internal organs and impair breathing. The weight of the costumes themselves was substantial. An elaborate evening gown with its multiple layers of silk, velvet trains, beaded embroidery, and built-in support structures could weigh 20 pounds or more. Add to this the weight of jewelry, heavy necklaces, tiaras, multiple bracelets, elaborate earrings, and the physical burden of an evening at the opera became significant. In diary entries and letters by women like Teresa Fair Ulrichs, daughter of Silver Baron James Graham Fair and later a prominent Newport hostess, there are scattered references to the physical toll of social performance. Later preserved along with some of her elaborate gowns and donated to museums, these documents include notes about long hours in the box and the fatigue of remaining upright, composed, and smiling through entire operas that could last 4 hours, including intermissions. One entry mentioned simply, "so heavy," a laconic comment that could refer to the emotional weight of social obligation, the physical burden of costume and corset, or both. The soundscape added its own layer of sensory experience. The rustle of taffeta and silk as women shifted position in their seats created a constant whisper of fabric throughout the horseshoe of boxes. The creaking of corset stays and the subtle sounds of breathing, sometimes labored from the constriction of tight lacing, formed an intimate acoustic background distinct from the orchestral music. During intermissions, the volume rose dramatically as conversations resumed and people moved between boxes to pay calls on friends and acquaintances. Temperature regulation in the Metropolitan before full electrification and modern climate control was primitive at best. The boxes, heated by the bodies packed into them and by the gas lighting that produced considerable warmth as a byproduct, could become uncomfortably hot while the backstage and corridor areas remained chilly. Women fanned themselves continuously, the motion of fans creating small breezes and also serving as a form of nonverbal communication. The language of fans, codified in etiquette books, allowed messages to be sent through the angle and speed of fan movement. Removing gloves was permitted only in the supper room attached to the opera house, never in the boxes themselves. The gloves remained on throughout the performance, regardless of how warm the evening became, creating another layer of barrier between skin and environment, another element of constraint disguised as refinement. At the end of a 3-act opera, a woman's shoulders would ache from hours of enforced uprightness. Her feet, compressed into narrow silk shoes, would throb. The corset's pressure on her ribs would have made deep breathing difficult throughout the evening. In a private letter written late at night after returning from the opera, one young woman noted simply, "So heavy." The architecture of elegance rested directly on disciplined and suffering flesh. The opera box was furnished not merely with velvet chairs and gilt decoration, but with female bodies trained to perform grace under conditions of sustained physical discomfort. By January 1896, the weekly rhythm of an upper-class heiress's life in New York during the winter social season ran through paper in all its forms: engraved calling cards with a woman's name and flowing script, heavy monogrammed stationery for personal correspondence, printed programs for balls and cotillions, and the small gilt-edged opera cards that listed the evening's performance and the names of those occupying each box. Every aspect of social interaction generated documents, and managing this flow of paper, knowing when to send which kind of card, how to phrase which sort of note, what the various formats signaled about one's intentions and social position, constituted a significant part of elite women's labor. Historians examining the social world of figures like Mrs. Carolyn Astor have documented how opera attendance functioned as a gateway to deeper social acceptance. A visit to Mrs. Astor's opera box, being invited to sit in her presence during an intermission, perhaps to be introduced to other occupants, was often a prerequisite to receiving an invitation to her famous annual ball at her Fifth Avenue mansion. The route to the most exclusive social events literally passed through the Golden Horseshoe, and those who failed to secure such access found their social advancement stalled. Society columns in newspapers like the New York Times and in more specialized publications like Town Topics transformed the opera house seating into a public ledger of social position. Each Monday during the season, these publications printed lists of which boxes had been occupied the previous evening, and by whom, sometimes with brief descriptions of particularly notable gowns or jewelry. Families subscribed to clipping services or maintained their own scrapbooks, cutting out and preserving mentions of their names and social activities. Surviving scrapbooks kept by women such as Consuelo Vanderbilt, later Duchess of Marlborough, show pages where newspaper clippings documenting opera attendance are pasted alongside the actual engraved invitations to other events, creating a visual record of how public mentions and private correspondence intertwined. The scrapbooks served as both personal archives and as tools for managing social strategy. By reviewing past patterns of invitations and public appearances, a woman could identify which relationships needed cultivation, which alliances seemed to be cooling, which families were rising or falling in social prominence. After each significant social event, including evenings at the opera, thank you notes were expected, written in sloping cursive script on heavy personalized stationery, acknowledging the kindness of those who had invited one to share their box, thanking hostesses for introductions made, expressing appreciation for the pleasure of the evening's company. These notes followed strict conventions regarding timing, sent within 24 hours of the event, length, brief but not perfunctory, and tone, warmth calibrated to the intimacy of the relationship. A young heiress preparing to write such notes after an evening at the Metropolitan would seat herself at her writing desk, arrange her monogram stationery and her pen, and often pause before beginning. In that moment, her hands would sometimes perform the familiar gesture of smoothing her gloves one final time before removing them to write, a transitional movement marking the shift from public performance to private labor, from the visible spectacle of the opera box to the behind-the-scenes work of maintaining social position through correspondence. The opera box, viewed through this lens of paper and ink and engraved cards, revealed itself to be not merely a physical seat in a theater, but a node in an extensive network of communication. What appeared to casual observers as spontaneous social interaction, a graceful wave from one box to another, a brief conversation during intermission, an introduction that seemed to happen by chance, had often been meticulously arranged through days or weeks of correspondence, with multiple letters exchanged to coordinate timing, ensure appropriate parties would be present, and prepare the ground for what would appear as effortless sociability. The gloved hand that waved from a gilt box rail might have written half a dozen letters in the preceding week to make that particular evening, that specific encounter, possible. The social architecture of the opera house, impressive in its visible gilt and velvet, was supported by an invisible infrastructure of paper, notes, cards, letters, printed announcements, without which the whole elaborate system of display and connection would have collapsed. On a spring evening in April 1898, at the Palais Garnier in Paris, the ornate opera house designed by Charles Garnier and completed in 1875, the red and gold interior framed a scene that would have been instantly familiar to any regular attendee of New York's Metropolitan Opera. Women seated in private lodges, boxes, arranged around the horseshoe of the auditorium, their bodies half turned toward the stage and half toward the rest of the house, engaged in the perpetual negotiation between watching the performance and being watched by other opera-goers. Contemporary French commentators describe the Palais Garnier's foyer and box tiers as functioning essentially as a club privé for haute société, a space more fundamentally about social gathering and strategic display than about serious musical listening. The architecture itself encouraged this use. The grand foyer, with its elaborate painted ceiling and enormous mirrors, provided space for promenading during intermissions. The wide corridors connecting boxes allowed for visiting between loges, and the boxes themselves were designed with anterooms where servants could wait and where guests could gather before returning to their seats. American painter Mary Cassatt, herself from a wealthy Pennsylvania family and deeply embedded in Parisian artistic circles, produced a remarkable visual archive of women in opera boxes during this period. Her paintings in the Loge, 1878, and Woman with a Pearl Necklace in a Loge, 1879, among others, captured moments of female spectatorship that were simultaneously moments of being spectated. In one characteristic image, a woman dressed in black raises her opera glasses to view the stage, her gloved arm, creating a diagonal line of tension across the composition, while her face reveals the double awareness that she is both looking and being looked at. American heiresses traveling on what was called the European circuit, young women whose families took them to Paris, London, and sometimes Rome and Vienna during the social season, sat in rented lodges at the Palais Garnier, carefully observing and copying the physical deportment of French aristocratic women. They noted the particular angle at which Parisian women held their heads, the precise moment when it became acceptable to begin conversing during a performance, the choreography of greetings exchanged across the auditorium through small nods and raised opera glasses. In letters sent home to family members in America, some of these traveling heiresses recorded their impressions of Parisian opera attendance. A few expressed genuine thrill at being seen in the same magnificent house as titled European nobility, at participating in a social ritual that seemed more ancient and legitimate than anything available in New York. Others, writing with cooler and more analytical pens, observed that beneath the surface differences of language and setting, the fundamental dynamics differed little from the Metropolitan. The same careful management of appearance, the same strategic positioning of bodies in space, the same use of opera attendants as cover for social negotiation and alliance building. The physical experience involved the same basic elements as in New York: heavy evening gowns, tight corsets, long gloves that remained on throughout the performance, jewelry that became uncomfortably heavy over the course of a long evening. The temperature in the loges, heated by gas lighting and closely packed bodies, could be stifling. The acoustic properties of the enormous hall sometimes made the actual music difficult to hear from certain box positions, a problem that serious music lovers complained about, but that seemed to bother social opera-goers very little, since hearing every note was not their primary purpose for attending. In Paris, the opera box became another space that could be conspicuously occupied, demonstrating cosmopolitan sophistication and international social connections, or conspicuously left empty, perhaps because one was attending a more exclusive private concert or salon, signaling through absence one's access to even more rarefied social circles. The Loge, like the box in New York, taught these traveling American women that privilege was a vocabulary that could be learned, that could be performed with different accents in different cities, but that followed fundamentally similar grammar wherever it appeared. The specific conventions differed: precisely when to arrive, how late one could enter without giving offense, which intermissions were for visiting and which for remaining seated, but the underlying principle remained constant. The opera box was a stage for performing social identity, and successful performance required disciplined attention to local rules that were rarely written down but were absolutely enforced. In June 1901, during the first London social seasons after Queen Victoria's death in January of that year, the Royal Opera House at Covent Garden still carried the visible marks of her extraordinarily long reign. Decades earlier, when the theater had been rebuilt in the 1850s after a fire, records documented that a private box should be reserved for her use for the ensuing season. And this royal box, positioned prominently to the side of the stage, and fitted, according to contemporary accounts, in the most tasteful manner, had remained a fixture of the house's architecture and social geography throughout her reign and beyond. By the turn of the century, with Victoria gone and her son Edward VII bringing a different style of monarchy more interested in continental European sophistication than his mother's austere court, Covent Garden's Opera House served as a crucial venue for both established British aristocracy and the increasing number of American dollar princesses who were marrying into British-titled families. The opera boxes at Covent Garden functioned as stages for dynastic dramas large and small. Betrothals were hinted at by which young man and woman were observed sharing a box or being introduced in adjacent loges during intermissions. Cooling alliances between families were signaled by who carefully avoided eye contact across the auditorium. Political negotiations between cabinet ministers might be conducted sotto voce in boxes during particularly loud portions of Wagner. Contemporary diaries and memoirs by women navigating Anglo-American society in this period, including figures like Jennie Jerome Churchill, later Lady Randolph Churchill, the American-born mother of Winston Churchill, and Consuelo Vanderbilt, who had married the Duke of Marlborough in 1895. Mention opera nights in London as being simultaneously pleasurable and exhausting, part of an unrelenting round of social obligations that consume the season from May through July. To be seen regularly at Covent Garden was essential for maintaining one's position, but the cumulative fatigue of so many evenings performing refinement in public took its toll. For American heiresses newly arrived in London, either as tourists testing the waters of European society or as recent brides still learning to navigate their adopted country's intricate social hierarchies, attendance at Covent Garden presented particular challenges. British aristocratic society, for all its willingness to accept American money through marriage alliances, remained deeply invested in subtle markers of distinction that could be difficult for newcomers to read accurately. Titled families occupied boxes that had been associated with their names for generations, and the seating arrangements reflected complex precedence rules based on the exact rank of each family's title. An American woman, even one who had married a duke or earl, might find herself uncertain about small but significant details. When exactly to arrive? Too early suggested over-eagerness, too late implied disrespect for other opera-goers. How to dress? British standards of what constituted appropriate evening dress differed subtly from American conventions. Whom to acknowledge with a nod, and whom to ignore despite their presence in adjacent boxes, reflecting feuds and alliances she might not fully understand. In the boxes themselves, the heiress would once again perform the familiar ritual of adjusting her long white gloves before standing during intermissions, checking that each button was properly fastened, smoothing the kid leather over her forearms with movements that had become automatic through years of training. In a city dense with genuine aristocratic titles stretching back centuries, her wealth would be evaluated first and foremost through her comportment, whether she could inhabit these exclusive spaces with the kind of ease that suggested she belonged there, that her presence was natural rather than purchased. The physical demands remained constant across cities. The long hours of sitting upright in a corset, the weight of elaborate gowns and heavy jewelry, the requirement to maintain an expression of pleasant interest regardless of whether the opera was actually interesting or the company in one's box was congenial. The temperature in the boxes during crowded evenings could be stifling, and the practice of remaining fully gloved throughout the performance meant one's hands became uncomfortably warm and sometimes slightly damp inside the kid leather. From New York to Paris to London, the opera box revealed itself as less a comfortable room for enjoying music then a demanding test of whether a woman could inhabit privileged space in ways that reassured others of her belonging, without ever quite revealing the effort such performance required, or the uncertainties that might lie beneath the polished surface. Soon, for some women, the choice not to appear in their boxes at all, to leave them conspicuously dark and empty, would speak more loudly than any carefully staged attendance ever could. By February 1902, the Metropolitan Opera's golden horseshoe had settled into a well-understood social function that extended beyond mere entertainment into the realm of matrimonial strategy. Social historians examining the period have documented how the opera boxes, now firmly controlled by the families of the 70 original stockholders and their heirs, served as particularly effective venues for displaying eligible daughters to carefully curated audiences of suitable men. Younger sons of wealthy families, visiting titled Europeans, promising young diplomats and professionals whose prospects suggested they might be appropriate matches. The architecture of the house facilitated this function. Unlike a ballroom, where potential suitors might approach too directly or where chaperones had to constantly monitor who was dancing with whom, the opera box created a more controlled environment. Mothers could seat their daughters between trusted older relatives or family friends, positioning them where their profiles would be visible to neighboring boxes and to the dress circle below, while maintaining tight supervision over who could approach and under what circumstances. Memoirs and biographical accounts of women like Grace Wilson Vanderbilt, who married Cornelius Vanderbilt III in 1896, and Emily Post, who before her 1906 divorce had been a prominent figure in New York society, recall how young women in their late teens and early 20s were regularly seated in family opera boxes with their positioning and presentation carefully managed by their mothers. The view of a young woman in elaborate evening dress, properly jeweled, sitting with perfect posture in a prominent box, created an image of marriageability that was more powerful than any formal portrait could achieve, because it demonstrated the woman's ability to perform elite femininity in real time, under observation. A nod from a mother in one box to a matron in another box could initiate an entire sequence of subsequent interactions. Invitations to tea, suggestions that the young people might be seated near each other at an upcoming dinner party, carefully orchestrated carriage drives in Central Park where accidental encounters could occur. The opera season, running from October through April, thus dovetailed perfectly with the winter social calendar of balls and house parties, with the boxes functioning as the opening act in longer negotiations that might culminate in betrothals and marriages. The young heiress seated in her family's box, now in her early 20s, and understood by all observers to be available for matrimonial alliance, received explicit instruction about how to manage her presence, keep her gaze modest but not downcast, maintain her gloves in immaculate condition, any visible stain or worn spot suggesting carelessness about appearance, smile but in a measured way that did not seem too eager or too cold. Her presence in a particular box on a particular Monday evening was never accidental. Every appearance was a strategic choice about visibility, about which other families would be present that night, about what messages her attendance sent. The opera house's architecture drew literal lines of sight that functioned simultaneously as potential lines of kinship and alliance. Families whose boxes faced each other across the horseshoe could exchange glances more easily than those positioned side by side. Boxes in the center of the tiers, with optimal visibility, could survey more of the house and be seen from more angles. These geometric facts shape social strategy as surely as any difference in wealth or family name, but the very same staging that made the opera box effective for matrimonial display also created possibilities for resistance or at least for alternative performances. Every stage, after all, invites the possibility that an actress will one day refuse her assigned role and will use the visibility granted to her for purposes other than those her directors intended. The box that was meant to be a showcase could become, in certain circumstances, a platform for subtle declaration of independence. During the mid 1890s and into the early 1900s, society pages in New York newspapers began to treat absence from expected opera attendance as a form of news worthy of comment and interpretation. When prominent families were experiencing highly publicized marital difficulties, such as the 1895 divorce of Alva and William K. Vanderbilt, or other less public but widely whispered about estrangements among the Newport and Fifth Avenue set, society columnists noted when a woman has not been seen in her usual box for several weeks, or when a famous box that would normally be occupied on any given Monday evening remained conspicuously dark, its velvet chairs empty, and its occupants unexplained. The absence spoke volumes precisely because opera attendance had become so routine and expected. For a woman of social standing to miss one or two Monday nights might be explained by illness or travel. To miss several in succession suggested something more serious: possible scandal, family crisis, or deliberate withdrawal from social circulation. The empty box became a kind of negative space in the social landscape, as visible in its absence as any presence could be. Although private letters and diaries from this period rarely spelled out strategic calculations explicitly, women understood that correspondence could be shown to others, that privacy was never guaranteed. Later biographers reconstructing individual life stories have been able to piece together evidence that some women deliberately withdrew from opera attendance during periods of marital crisis or scandal, finding the boxes too public a venue in which to have their faces examined and their situations speculated upon by the hundreds of other opera-goers who would inevitably notice and interpret every detail of their appearance and demeanor. A woman going through divorce proceedings, or enduring a husband's publicly known infidelity, or managing family financial embarrassments, faced impossible choices at the opera. If she appeared in her box maintaining perfect composure, her performance might be read as either admirable stoicism or callous indifference to her situation. If she appeared but seemed distressed, her visible emotion would become fodder for gossip and might be interpreted as weakness, or as confirmation of whatever rumors were circulating. If she failed to appear, her absence would be noted and discussed, but at least she would be spared the direct scrutiny of hundreds of pairs of eyes examining her face for signs of distress. A darkened box on a Monday night at the Metropolitan or at the Old Academy became a sign of trouble as legible to informed observers as any savage political cartoon in magazines like Puck or Judge. The empty red velvet chairs, visible from multiple angles around the horseshoe, announced a crisis even when the specific nature of that crisis might remain unclear to those outside the innermost social circles. Our representative heiress, no longer young, now managing the fallout from an unhappy marriage whose difficulties have become too public to ignore, makes a choice that would have been almost unthinkable to her younger self. Rather than continuing to appear in her opera box and submit to the relentless examination of her peers, she remains home on Monday evenings, writing letters at her desk, managing correspondence, finding relief in the privacy of her own drawing room. The opera tickets, already purchased as part of the annual box subscription and representing a significant financial outlay, lie unused in a silver tray in the entrance hall, a small domestic monument to the decision to value privacy over visibility. The choice carries costs. Prolonged absence from the opera might be interpreted as an admission of defeat, as confirmation that whatever scandal or difficulty surrounds her has succeeded in driving her from her rightful place in society. But it also offers something that no amount of performance in a gilded box can provide: respite from constant surveillance, freedom from the requirement to compose one's face and body into acceptable shapes of refined suffering or resilient indifference. When society treats visibility as proof of stability and social survival, choosing deliberately not to be seen becomes its own quiet form of resistance, a declaration that there are limits to what one will perform and endure for the maintenance of appearances. By January 1914, as various newspaper articles and financial records document, the Metropolitan Opera's golden horseshoe boxes had become the most expensive regular theater seats in the world, requiring not only the initial capital investment in shares of the Metropolitan Opera and Real Estate Company, but also ongoing annual assessments to cover the company's persistent operating deficits. The financial burden was substantial. Each box provided 6 seats for every performance during the season, and box holders were assessed amounts that could reach several $1,000s annually in years when ticket sales and other revenues failed to cover the opera company's costs. Corporate minutes and financial records from the Metropolitan Opera and Real Estate Company, preserved in archives, show repeated discussions and sometimes heated debates among shareholders about assessment levels. Some stockholders began to find the burden unsustainable, particularly as multiple expenses accumulated. Maintaining a Fifth Avenue or Park Avenue townhouse in New York, a substantial cottage in Newport for the summer season, perhaps a house or rented properties in London or Paris for the European social season, plus the costs of appropriate staff, entertaining, clothing, jewelry, carriages, and later automobiles, and all the other requirements of maintaining visible elite status. The economic context was changing as well. Financial panics in 1893 and 1907 had rattled even very large fortunes, demonstrating that wealth that seemed permanent could be vulnerable to market forces. Tax structures were shifting, with the introduction of the federal income tax in 1913, creating new drains on fortunes that had previously been lightly taxed. The cost structure of elite social performance was rising as standards of display continued to escalate. Bigger houses, more servants, more elaborate entertainment, while some of the economic foundations supporting these expenditures were becoming less secure. Biographical studies of particular families during this period note that opera attendance often dwindled or ceased entirely in the years before World War I. And while some of this reflected changing tastes or loss of interest in opera as entertainment, economic factors played a significant role. The annual assessment notice from the Metropolitan Opera Company could become a moment of reckoning, forcing families to calculate whether maintaining their box still made financial and social sense. For a middle-aged woman who had spent decades understanding her opera box as an essential element of her social identity, receiving the annual assessment notice might provoke a crisis of calculation. Sitting at her desk in a Fifth Avenue townhouse, the formal notice before her requesting thousands of dollars to maintain the box for another season. Her long, white evening gloves lying unbuttoned and unused beside the papers. Opera attendance having become less frequent as her enthusiasm waned and her circumstances grew more complicated. She might pause to consider the arithmetic carefully. The price of being seen versus the relief of stepping back, the cost of maintaining this particular performance versus the freedom of relinquishing it. The decision to sell or surrender an opera box share carried undeniable social implications. It might be interpreted by observers as evidence of financial reverses, as admission that one could no longer afford to maintain one's previous position. It might lead to decreased visibility in other social contexts as well, since opera attendance had always been understood as one component of a larger pattern of elite social participation. But it could also represent liberation from an obligation that had become more burdensome than pleasurable, release from the requirement to perform refinement and stability for hours each week in a gilded box under the gaze of hundreds of observers. The Great War, about to begin in Europe and eventually draw in America as well, would render many of these boxes empty for reasons that no society column could spin into social triumph or even make comprehensible in terms of individual family strategy. The war would kill sons who might have inherited shares, would disrupt international social circuits, would make certain kinds of conspicuous display seem inappropriate during periods of national mourning and sacrifice. In its aftermath, the social world that had created and sustained the golden horseshoe as the apex of New York society would be permanently altered, though the physical boxes would survive for decades more, occupied by different families or rented for individual performances, their original social function gradually fading into memory. By 1918, with World War I reshaping American society and dramatically altering what kinds of public display seemed appropriate or even possible, opera houses in New York, London, and Paris took on different social tones than they had possessed during the Gilded Age and Edwardian period. The Metropolitan Opera in New York continued to function and even maintained much of its social cachet, but the composition of its audience had begun to shift in ways that would accelerate over the following decades. Boxes that had been occupied by the same families for a generation or more sometimes changed hands as older fortunes declined or as heirs decided that maintaining such expensive and visible positions no longer served their interests. In Europe, where the war's impact was far more immediate and devastating, wartime austerity and the mourning that followed the enormous casualties made elaborate social displays feel inappropriate or even obscene to many. The Royal Opera House at Covent Garden closed entirely from 1914 to 1919, used during the war as a furniture repository. The Palais Garnier in Paris continued some operations, but in a dramatically altered social context where appearing in evening gowns and jewels while men were dying in trenches nearby provoked justifiable criticism. The older Academy of Music in New York offered a cautionary precedent for what could happen when an opera house lost its social function and prestige. Having definitively lost the opera war to the Metropolitan in the 1880s, the Academy had canceled its opera season in 1886. By the early 20th century, the building hosted vaudeville performances, motion pictures, and other forms of mass entertainment far removed from the elite social rituals that had once made its 18 boxes the most coveted seats in the city. Later, observers and architectural historians examining the building's decline described the old academy in vivid terms as a withered crone reduced to housing popular entertainment for general audiences. Its boxes, once the sites of such careful social positioning, having become mere architectural features in a hall marketed to people who would never have been admitted to the exclusive Monday night opera performances of the 1870s. For women who had spent decades understanding opera boxes as central to their social identities, the changes brought by war and its aftermath could be disorienting. A now middle-aged woman returning to the Metropolitan Opera in the early 1920s for the first time in several years might find the experience strangely altered. She might choose to sit further back in the house, perhaps purchasing tickets in the orchestra section, rather than attempting to reclaim her family's former box, which might now be occupied by different owners or rented by the evening. From this new vantage point, anonymous among other audience members rather than displayed in a prominent box, she could watch the current occupants of the boxes she once knew intimately. And she might notice, with the small shock of recognition that comes from seeing one's own gestures reflected in another, that a woman seated in the box that had once been hers performs the same careful adjustment of long white gloves, smoothing the kid leather from wrist to elbow with practiced movements, that she herself had learned to make decades earlier. The ritual persists even as the particular performers change, transmitted through generations, not through explicit instruction but through observation and imitation. Young women watching older women and absorbing the physical vocabulary of elite femininity without necessarily understanding all the meanings those gestures once carried. The buildings outlived the social scripts written into their architectural details. Seats that once defined a person's social identity and that seemed permanent fixtures of family prestige can be reassigned without ceremony, sold to new owners, rented by the performance, or simply left empty as economic circumstances change and social priorities shift. What remains more fixed than any particular audience is the physical memory embedded in the architecture itself, the gilt railings where gloved hands once rested, the velvet chairs where women sat for hours in corseted discomfort, the sight lines that once structured social hierarchies through the simple geometry of who could see whom from which angle. On a weekday afternoon in the 1960s, long after the social world that had created the Metropolitan Opera's golden horseshoe as the apex of New York society had faded into history, a photographer from the Historic American Buildings Survey arrived at the old Metropolitan Opera House at Broadway and 39th Street to document its interior before the building's demolition. The opera company was preparing to move to a new facility at Lincoln Center, and the old building, opened with such fanfare in 1883, was scheduled to be torn down to make way for an office tower. The photographer's images, preserved in the Library of Congress's archives, show the ornate interior of the house empty of audience, the famous golden horseshoe of boxes lit only for the camera's lens, the red velvet chairs unoccupied, the gilt decoration still intact, but the social world it had served long vanished. The photographs are technically documentary, intended simply to record architectural details before destruction, but they carry an elegiac quality, capturing spaces that had been designed for human performance and display now silent and abandoned. Around these same decades, museum curators at institutions like the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Museum of the City of New York, and various historical societies began systematically cataloging donations from descendants of Gilded Age families. Evening gloves in pristine condition, carefully preserved in tissue paper. Elaborate opera cloaks with fur trim and silk lining. Ornate fans made of ivory, silk, and feathers. Complete evening ensembles with their matching jewelry and accessories. These objects, donated by families who no longer had use for such specialized formal wear or who wanted to preserve family history, were interpreted by curators and exhibition designers as material evidence of a vanished world of rigid etiquette and elaborate social display. Museum visitors walking through exhibitions on the Gilded Age and Edwardian period encounter portraits of women seated in opera boxes, often posed to display their gowns and jewels to best advantage. They see Mary Cassatt's paintings of women in loges at Parisian opera houses, visual studies of female spectatorship that are simultaneously studies of women being spectated. They examine fashion plates showing the evolution of evening dress styles from the 1880s through the 1910s. And they pause before glass cases displaying actual artifacts. A pair of white kid opera gloves, elbow length with tiny pearl buttons running from wrist to elbow, laid out flat on neutral fabric under museum lighting. An opera cloak of midnight blue velvet lined with cream silk. A mother of pearl and ivory fan with painted scenes of aristocratic leisure. The exhibition labels mention names that visitors might recognize. Caroline Astor, whose jewels were legendary and whose box at the Metropolitan helped define New York society for a generation. Alva Vanderbilt, who fought her way into elite circles and then used her position to advocate for women's suffrage. Consuelo Vanderbilt, who became Duchess of Marlborough and later wrote a memoir about the constraints of her gilded life. Many more women who occupied these boxes and wore these gloves remain unnamed in the historical record. Their individual stories lost, but their collective experience preserved through the material objects they left behind. In one museum exhibition case, a pair of white kid opera gloves is displayed with a slight curve to them, as if the gloves still remember the shape of hands that wore them, still retain some trace of the gesture of resting on a box rail while surveying the opera house below. The museum's conservation records note that these particular gloves show wear patterns consistent with repeated use, the leather slightly stretched at certain button positions, faint discoloration at the fingertips where skin oils have penetrated the kid leather despite careful handling, small repaired tear at one wrist, suggesting an evening when a button was fastened too hastily or under too much tension. No diary or letter preserved in the archive tells us exactly what passed through the mind of the woman who wore these gloves on any particular evening at the opera. The documentary record preserves social patterns and public behaviors more readily than private doubts or quiet rebellions. We know that she sat in her box, that she adjusted her gloves with practiced movements, that she observed and was observed according to the elaborate protocols of her social world. What we cannot know with certainty is how she felt about this performance, whether the gilded box felt like a throne or a cage, or some complicated mixture of both. The opera boxes themselves, the physical spaces where all this social performance occurred, survive now primarily as photographs in archives, as floor plans in architectural records, as routes on guided tours of surviving opera houses where docents explain to curious visitors how the social elite of another era used these spaces. The Metropolitan Opera House that opened in 1883 was demolished in 1967. Its golden horseshoe dispersed or destroyed. Its red velvet chairs sold to collectors. Its gilt decoration salvaged by architectural preservation groups or simply discarded. The new Metropolitan Opera House at Lincoln Center, opened in 1966, has boxes, but they function differently in a cultural economy where opera is understood more as high art than as essential social ritual, where box holders are often corporate sponsors rather than hereditary elites, where the social meanings of visibility and display have shifted in ways that would be almost unrecognizable to the women of the 1880s and 1890s. What remains most powerful is not the buildings themselves, most of which have been demolished or drastically altered, but the objects preserved in museums and the memories embedded in photographs and written accounts. The gloves that once smoothed themselves so carefully before opera audiences now rest under climate-controlled glass, protected from the light and handling that would degrade the fragile kid leather. The gesture of adjusting them, learned through years of training, performed countless times in boxes across New York, Paris, and London, freighted with meanings about femininity and class and social performance, has become a frozen tableau, a curator's careful arrangement of historical artifacts. The seats those gloved hands once hovered above are gone, demolished or reassigned or transformed beyond recognition. But the pressure of expectation those gloves signified, the requirement to perform grace under observation, to maintain composure under constraint, to appear effortlessly elegant while managing physical discomfort and social anxiety, lingers quietly in the folded fingers of kid leather under museum glass, a material trace of immaterial burdens that shaped women's lives in ways both visible and hidden. Somewhere in the climate-controlled storage facility of a major museum, a curator conducting inventory opens a drawer in a flat file cabinet designed for storing textiles and accessories. Inside, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper, lies a pair of yellowed opera gloves, white kid leather that has aged to cream, the tiny pearl buttons still intact, the leather soft but brittle with age. The conservation record indicates they date from the 1890s, were donated by the descendants of a prominent New York family, and show evidence of having been worn regularly rather than merely preserved as new. The curator lifts one glove carefully, supporting it fully to avoid stress on the fragile leather, and notes how it naturally curves slightly, shaped by long ago use, by hands that wore it repeatedly to opera performances and balls and other formal occasions. The gesture of adjusting these gloves, pulling gently at each finger to ensure proper fit, smoothing the kid leather up the forearm, checking that each button was fastened, had been carefully learned by the woman who wore them, practiced until it became automatic, performed hundreds of times in opera boxes and ballrooms across decades of social performance. That gesture has now become a still life, preserved only in the curve of leather under museum lights, in the worn places that indicate repeated use, in the conservation notes that document an object's material history while remaining silent about the human experience it represents. The opera house seats those gloves once hovered above. The red velvet chairs, the gilt box rails, the specific boxes in the golden horseshoe where particular families sat for generations, are gone, demolished when the old Metropolitan Opera House was destroyed in 1967, scattered to collectors and preservation societies, or simply discarded as obsolete furniture. But something persists beyond the demolished buildings and the scattered objects. In the curve of aged kid leather, in the photographs of women posed in opera boxes, in the written accounts of social rituals and constraints, there remains evidence of a world where performance was required, where visibility was both privilege and burden, where grace was achieved through discipline and maintained through suppression of discomfort and doubt. The gloves, preserved now in their drawer, outlive the hands that wore them and the boxes those hands adorned, becoming witnesses to a vanished architecture of expectation where women learned to shape themselves, their bodies, their gestures, their visible lives, according to standards they did not create and could rarely fully escape.